Thank you, Andrew, and thank you to the Presidential Scholars in Society and Neuroscience for having us all here today. So the human brain has been termed the most complex 3 pounds in the universe. And it's not hard to see why when we consider the fact that we're born with 100 billion neurons or brain cells. And in the first few months of life, every minute we generate between 250,000 and 500,000 new brain cells. But it turns out that most growth of the human brain is not actually the development of these new neurons, but connections between the neurons. And these brain connections become increasingly complex in early childhood in the first 3 or 4 years of life. So here you see a picture of the connections between brain cells at birth, at 3 months, and at 2 years. And we have approximately 1,000 trillion connections between cells by age 3. Now, importantly, early experience shapes this brain developmental process. So you may have heard of the use it or lose it phenomenon, whereby connections that are used frequently are strengthened, whereas those that are not are dropped or pruned. And it turns out that the brain is most plastic or able to make new connections early in childhood. Now, of course, a child's experience varies dramatically as a function of his or her family's social and economic circumstances. And so we can use socioeconomic status as a lens through which to understand early brain development. So a little bit of background: what is poverty? Well, poverty is a number defined by the federal government that varies by family size and composition, meaning the number of adults and children in the home. Interestingly, it doesn't vary geographically. So a family here in New York City has the same poverty line set for them as a family in South Dakota, for example, even though, of course, the cost of living is quite different in those places. Now, currently, a family with 2 adults and 2 children has the poverty line set for them at just under $24,000. And although this is quite low, it's nonetheless incredibly prevalent, with more than 16 million children, or more than 1 in 5 U.S. children, currently living below the poverty line. And of course, growing up in poverty puts children at risk for a host of negative outcomes in terms of their physical health, mental health, and, pertinent to today, their cognitive and achievement outcomes. Now, it's important to recognize that socioeconomic status, or SES, is more than just poverty. I just told you that poverty is strictly based on family income, whereas SES is typically conceptualized as income, but also things like parental educational attainment, occupational prestige, and more recently, subjective social status, or where one sees oneself on the socioeconomic hierarchy. And we know that when child SES is conceptualized in this way, it tends to be strongly associated with a number of important cognitive developmental outcomes. Things like achievement test scores, grade retention, literacy, IQ, and school graduation rates. And in fact, the SES gap in these achievement outcomes tends to emerge early and really widen throughout the elementary years. So these are data that I'm about to show you from the British cohort study of 1970, which followed tens of thousands of children in the UK longitudinally from about age 2 to about age 10. So first, I want to direct your attention to children who started out at age 2 better on a metric of cognitive performance than 90% of other 2-year-olds. So they were performing at the 90th percentile at age 2. And these were children who happened to come from higher socioeconomic homes. So these high SES, high early scoring children tended to perform above average throughout the course of childhood, perhaps not so surprising. Next, I want to draw your attention to children who started out at the 10th percentile, so outperforming only 10% of other 2-year-olds at age 2, who happened to come from socioeconomically disadvantaged homes. So unfortunately, but perhaps not surprisingly, those low SES, low early scoring children tended to perform below average throughout the course of childhood. Somewhat more surprising is what happens when we consider what we might term the crossover groups. So first, let's consider children who also started out at the 10th percentile at age 2, but who happen to come from socioeconomically advantaged homes. So those children actually rose in their relative rank over the course of childhood, such that by age 10, they were actually performing at or maybe even a little bit above average. And finally, and most disconcertingly, what happened to those children who were outperforming 90% of other 2-year-olds, but who happened to come from socioeconomically disadvantaged homes? Well, those low SES, high early scoring children actually fell in their relative rank over the course of childhood, such that by age 10, a child's family socioeconomic circumstance is actually a much better predictor of children's cognitive outcomes than is early cognitive ability. So I think that's a particularly dramatic illustration of the growth of these gaps in achievement over the course of childhood. And so this might lead us to asking what factors contribute to this SES gap. So we might think of things like nutrition, differences in prenatal care or perinatal complications, prenatal drug exposure, differences in exposure to environmental toxicants like secondhand smoke or lead, differences in the home or learning environment or early schooling, differences in family stress. And to this list and the many others that you all could likely come up with, I would say yes, really each of these has been shown to contribute in part to the link between SES and cognitive skill. So how do we make sense of this? Well, one way is to recognize that quote-unquote cognitive skill is really too broad of a term. So traditional achievement measures like IQ or high school graduation rate aren't specific in terms of brain function. Put another way, there's no high school graduation nucleus in the brain, right? We know that the brain supports distinct cognitive skills through distinct circuits. And so we can ask which particular cognitive skills and corresponding brain areas or circuits seem to be most strongly associated with socioeconomic status. And so that brings us to a cognitive neuroscience approach. Cognitive neuroscience, again, teaches us that different structures and circuits support different kinds of cognitive skills, like language, memory, executive function, which has to do with the ability to inhibit inappropriate responses and remain on the task at hand, and visual spatial skills, among many others. And so by using a cognitive neuroscience approach, we can ask which core cognitive system or systems seems to be most highly associated with SES. And that's exactly the approach that we took in a series of studies about 10 years ago now, in which we recruited socioeconomically diverse families with children ranging in age from kindergarten through adolescence. And we simply asked, on a behavioral level, which particular cognitive skills seem to show the strongest socioeconomic disparities. And remarkably, our results were quite consistent across ages. So from kindergarten through adolescence, we found quite dramatic socioeconomic differences in children's language performance, with more modest but nonetheless consistent differences in memory and certain forms of executive function, which again has to do with the ability to inhibit inappropriate impulses. So this led us to several new questions which we are currently investigating in my lab. First, just how early are socioeconomic disparities detectable in infancy or early childhood? Those initial studies started out looking at kindergartners, and we were already seeing dramatic differences. So going back in time, how early in childhood can we detect these differences? Secondly, how do these differences relate to differences in children's brain structure and function? Third, which experiences, and particularly modifiable experiences, seem to explain SES differences in cognitive and brain development? And finally, how can this work inform interventions? So we'll touch on each of these briefly in the remainder of the talk, and then I'm happy to answer questions further in the discussion period. So first, asking the question of how early are effects detectable. Well, we recently had the opportunity to examine 180 infants from 9 to 15 months or from 15 to 21 months who came from socioeconomically diverse homes. And we found that children of more highly educated parents tended to have better language skills by 21 months of age. So here on the x-axis we have age at 9, 15, and 21 months. On the y-axis, we have a score on a language composite with the units being z-scores, so a score of 0 means that they are performing at the mean for that age. And in blue, we have children from the most highly educated parents, red children from middle educated parents, and green children from the least educated parents. And so you can see the emergence of these disparities between 15 and 21 months of age, so that during this time, the children of the most highly educated parents are rising to the top of the distribution, whereas the children of the least educated parents are unfortunately falling to the bottom of the distribution. And it turns out that this difference is not only statistically significant, but what we might term clinically significant as well, with the difference between the blue and the green lines at 21 months representing 0.8 standard deviations, which is a large effect size, equivalent in magnitude to 12 IQ points. Now again, this wasn't an IQ test, it was a composite of infant language measures, but nonetheless gives you a sense of just how large the disparities already are before children even turn 2. And we saw the same picture developing for memory skills as well. So again, by 21 months of age, we're seeing about 0.8 standard deviations of difference between children from the most highly educated parents versus children from the least educated parents. Okay. So moving on to our next question, how do these differences relate to differences in children's brain structure and function? Well, last year we published a study of about 1,100 children and adolescents between the ages of 3 and 20, in which we found that higher family income was associated with larger cortical surface area. So that means the size of the nooks and crannies on the surface of the brain, the cortex being the part of the brain that does most of the cognitive heavy lifting. So everywhere that you see a color represents an area where at that point there was a significant association between family income and children's surface area. So you can see that this relationship holds true across most of the brain. Nonetheless, there are some regions that are relatively stronger in this association than others. So the strongest associations are represented in yellow, and you can see them that they represent regions that support language as well as executive functioning. So again, this is sort of recapitulating some of the behavioral data that we had found previously. Now, a couple of points to note about this finding. First of all, the relationship was nonlinear. So the relationship between income and children's surface area was greatest among the most disadvantaged children, meaning that dollar for dollar, any increase in income was associated with proportionally greater differences in brain structure among the most disadvantaged families. Secondly, there's really dramatic variation from person to person here. So yes, across the sample of 1,100 children and adolescents, this is generally the pattern that we saw. Nonetheless, there were many children from low-income families who had larger surface areas, and many children from high-income families who had lower surface areas. So it's certainly not the case that I could know a child's family income and predict with any accuracy what that particular child's surface area would look like. An analogy I often give is with gender and height. So we all know that in childhood, at any one age, boys tend to be taller than girls, but of course there are lots of girls who are going to be taller than lots of boys. So it's not a one-to-one correspondence. And lastly, there are likely multiple mechanisms at play here. So we can't say from these data what is causing what. This is purely an association. Resting on the shoulders of our social science colleagues, we believe that this is likely largely due to differences in experience that are associated with differences growing up from socioeconomic disadvantage, but we can't for sure talk about causality from these data. So we can ask though, well, is it likely to be experienced? So findings from things like adoption studies, twin studies, studies of the timing of poverty, looking at differences in whether poverty is experienced early in childhood versus later, as well as studies of interventions, all point us to this likelihood that at least some of the disparities we're finding in socioeconomic differences, both in cognition and in brain development, are likely related to experience. Now, if that's true, and at least if we're talking about postnatal experiences, then one might hypothesize that we would not see socioeconomic differences in children's brain structure or function at birth. So in a study that we published 2 months ago now, since it's May, we were able to actually look at neonatal brain function using EEG or electroencephalogram. So this is a technique whereby we apply nets to the surface of young infants' heads while they sleep, and we're able to measure brain electrical activity at the scalp in a non-invasive way. And in fact, we found absolutely no relationship between family socioeconomic circumstance and brain function using this metric at birth. So if we're right, and experience may be in part accounting for these socioeconomic differences in brain structure and function that emerge over the course of childhood, we can ask what experiences are likely explaining these differences. So I showed you this slide before. My lab is particularly interested in two of these, namely the home language environment and family stress. So I'm going to just give you the briefest flavor of the ways that we're asking whether these particular experiences might be accounting for these differences. And again, I'm happy to answer more questions later. So first, asking the question of whether the home language environment may explain SES differences in brain structure or function. Well, we know from work by people like Hart and Risley and many others that there are dramatic socioeconomic disparities in the quality and quantity of words that children hear in the home. So we're actually able to measure the home language environment using a digital recorder known as the LENA, or Language Environment Analysis Tool. It's a small 2-ounce recorder that fits in the pocket of specialized clothing that children wear over the course of a couple days at home. Then the Lena gets plugged into our computers back in the lab and automatically analyzes the language environment in the recordings, producing these nice outputs, including things like the number of adult words that the children hear over the course of these 2 days, as well as things like conversational turns, which is a measure of the responsiveness or back and forth nature of these verbal interactions. And we're just beginning to analyze these data, but preliminarily we are seeing some relationships between the home language environment and children's brains. So here we have a measure of the quantity of parental talk to children on the x-axis and the size of the left superior temporal gyrus, which is a region in the left hemisphere that supports various aspects of language and reading processing. So to ask this other question of whether chronic stress may be explaining SES differences in the brain, so here we're actually able to take a biological measure of a certain stress hormone known as cortisol. Most commonly, cortisol is measured using saliva, which is fine, but that leads to a number of methodological challenges. So salivary cortisol tends to dramatically vary as a function of time of day of week, whether the child is taking any medications, the child's mood, as well as a host of other things. Excuse me. The nice thing about hair is that cortisol is chronically secreted into hair, and so we can take a small amount of hair and assay it for chronic hair cortisol, which is more likely to represent sort of a chronic measure of stress experienced. And we know that there are certain brain regions that seem to be particularly susceptible to the effects of stress. In part, the hippocampus, shown here in green, which largely supports children's memory development, as well as regions in the prefrontal cortex, which support executive functioning. So we are finding that indeed higher socioeconomic status in the family is associated with reduced hair cortisol in children. And this holds even when we're controlling for parents' hair cortisol. And I don't have data to show you, but I'm told hot off the presses by my postdoc that in fact we're seeing links between family stress and children's amygdala size, which is a structure located deep within the temporal lobes of the brain that's largely involved in emotion processing. Okay, so I've given you a flavor of the pathway that we're envisioning here, namely that distal factors like family socioeconomic circumstance are really serving as a proxy for differences in experience, which in turn are likely to have direct and cascading effects on children's brain and cognitive development. And so if we're right and experience matters, it begs the question, can this work inform interventions? And if so, then what is the right level at which to intervene? So we might imagine intervening at what I'm calling the most proximal level, at the level of school-based interventions, trying to target children's cognitive development directly. And certainly that's the most common form of intervention aimed at reducing socioeconomic gaps in children's achievement. And of course, results can be very promising. There are a number of very well-executed, well-designed interventions that really do seem to move the needle somewhat. Of course, the downside is that high-quality school interventions tend to be quite labor-intensive and costly if done right, and they often suffer from fade-out. So this is the idea that immediately after the intervention you often see effects, but 6 months, a year, 2 years, 5 years later, those effects often fade out, so you're no longer seeing differences between your intervention group and your control group, suggesting perhaps that the intervention dose needs to be longer or larger, which again adds to the labor intensity and the cost. And then finally, I would suggest that if we're waiting until school to intervene, we're likely waiting too late. I already told you that we're seeing dramatic socioeconomic differences before children turn 2. So while no one would argue against the importance of high-quality early childhood education, if we're waiting until children are in formal school systems, we're likely waiting too late. Okay, so what about moving a step back, aiming at the level of children's experiences through parenting interventions? Well, again, there are a number of high-quality parenting interventions out there, things like nurse-family partnerships, for instance, that do move the needle somewhat. Again, these tend to be labor-intensive and quite costly if done right. not only do parent interventions face the same problems of fade out, but when you're dealing with parents directly, it can often be quite difficult to get parents to take up the intervention, and you're often dealing with greater levels of attrition as well. It's challenging to engage disadvantaged families. And of course it's difficult to scale up. So it's one thing to, invite a few dozen or even a couple hundred moms into your lab to teach them about the importance of talking frequently and richly with your children or engaging in some kind of stress reduction intervention. It's quite another to scale that up to the level that could be effective at the community or greater. And finally, it's difficult to target multiple experience pathways in a single intervention. So again, we could teach parents about talking to their kids, we could teach parents about engaging in a warm manner. It's hard, we could teach parents about providing good nutrition. It's hard to do it all in a single intervention effectively. So finally, for the last portion of this talk, I'd like to challenge you to think about the idea of intervening at the most distal level by changing family SES itself. So we know from social science work and correlational work that small income boosts can have large effects. So for example, a $4,000 increase in annual income between the prenatal year and age 2 has been associated with improvements for those children when they become adults. So increases in adult earnings, increases in the number of annual hours spent in the labor force, and even some evidence for improved health in adulthood. So with those kind of results in mind, I'm really proud to be part of a group of social scientists and neuroscientists from around the country who are currently planning the first clinical trial of poverty reduction in early childhood. So the goal of this study is to recruit 1,000 poor mothers nationally, randomize half to receiving a large monthly income supplement, the other half to receiving a nominal monthly income supplement, and the families will receive these monthly income supplements every month for the first 3 years of their children's lives. So families will be recruited in the hospital at the time of giving birth. They'll be provided with a preloaded debit card upon leaving the hospital, and that debit card will be reloaded with these cash supplements every month for the next 3 years. We're then proposing to follow these families annually for the next 3 years until children turn 3, so that we can assess the direct causal impact of poverty reduction on children's cognitive, emotional, and brain development in the first 3 years when we know that the developing brain is most malleable to experience. So in this way, we're going to get past some of these issues of not being able to disentangle correlation and causation, and really being able to have sort of the definitive gold standard in a randomized control trial to assess the impacts of income on children's cognitive and brain development. We believe that this income is likely to impact change through 2 main pathways. One that we're calling an increase in enrichment or increased investment pathway. So this is the idea that with more money, parents can buy more books and toys, take more trips to the museum, afford higher quality childcare, better nutrition, perhaps move to better neighborhoods in better housing. And the other pathway is what we're calling the reduced stress pathway. So this is this idea that if parents aren't so worried about keeping the lights on or paying the rent, they're able to engage in a more warm, more nurturing manner with their children, freeing up some bandwidth to engage in higher quality parenting, which we know has cascading effects for children's development. So we recently completed a pilot study of this work in my lab on 30 low-income moms here in New York. We were pleased to find that our methods seem to be quite feasible, with 93% retention over the course of the year. Very few moms reported problems with the debit cards, and this was notable given that over 1 in 5 of these pilot study moms had never used a debit card previously. Now, moms in qualitative interviews typically reported using the money for the baby, but the nice thing about having a debit card is that we don't have to take their word for it. We're actually able to track their expenses with the mom's permission. Now, I don't expect you to read each of these transactions that occurred over the course of 12 months, but one thing I do like to point out is that in these over 1,100 transactions, there were exactly 3 that took place at a liquor store. And now when we launched the pilot, we were really doing it in the hopes of testing out feasibility and implementation of procedures. But in fact, we were quite pleased to find that our intervention group indeed showed some preliminary benefits relative to the control group. So again, I urge you to take these with a grain of salt given the small sample size of 15 moms in each group. Nonetheless, patterns suggested higher center-based childcare expenditures, more frequent reports of mother-child activities, less household chaos, and less parenting stress. And on each of these measures, we saw differences of about half a standard deviation. So to close, I ask you whether boosting family income may indeed change children's trajectories for the better. And if indeed our hypotheses are borne out in a larger study, then this work could potentially inform debates on the generosity or cuts to both existing and new social service programs that affect families with young children. Things like SNAP or food stamps, the Women, Infant, and Children program that also provides food and other services to disadvantaged families with young children, TANF, which is temporary assistance to needy families, housing vouchers, as well as things that have been in the news quite a bit lately, like paid family leave and the minimum wage. So while I would certainly never suggest that income is the only or the most important factor in children's brain development, it may be the most manipulable from a policy perspective. All right, so I think my time is up. Thank you very much for your attention, and I'm happy to take questions during the discussion.